Hello and welcome to Bristol Ideas. This interview is part of a free series available on the Bristol Ideas YouTube channel and the watch section of the Bristol Ideas website. So please do have a look at some of the others. This event is also in partnership with Spike Island Gallery as part of a series of events celebrating writers from around the world. I'm Jessica Andrews, the author of Saltwater, which was published in 2019, and Milk Teeth, which will be published in July. I'm really excited to be chatting to novelist and translator Claudia Durastanti about her most recent novel, Strangers I Know, which is published in the UK by Fitzcarraldo. Hi, Claudia.
Hi, Jessica. Hi.
Yeah, I'm really excited to speak to you about your brilliant book. And I thought we might open by talking about your relationship to truth, memory, and fiction. So this book is a novel, but I know that it has semi-autobiographical or autobiographical elements in it. And it seems very much to interrogate the boundaries of these things, which is something that I'm also personally really interested in. And I love the way that your work kind of second guesses itself. So there are details that your parents misremember, or kind of like family mythologies that change or are retold over time. And I wondered if you could talk about why it felt important to you to keep those things in, as maybe a way of like resisting, I don't know, a kind of like true cohesive narrative.
Yes, so Strangers I Know, which was originally called La Stañera, came out 3 years ago, at the same time that Saltwater was out. I remember that very well. And you can tell, I think, by the structure of the book that there was a sort of resistance in writing this book for a very long, long time. I didn't want the story of my family to be a debut novel, and I had high standards of what literature should be, and definitely memoir and autobiography was not included in it. My mother has always been an intense journal writer. She had these journals since she was a little girl. And to me, it was immediate in the household that autobiography would be the genre of survivors in a way. So you had this woman who had disability and deafness, partial borderline syndrome, had a very epic and reckless life. And so to me, the form of the journal, the autobiography, was also tied to gender in a way. If my mother had a different perspective or different aesthetical parameters, I would say it would be considered autofiction. So to me, it was very important to figure out who could write from what position and following what do you consider that genre to be. So I was with an author that I translate, Joshua Cohen, years ago, and I was mildly thinking about writing sentimental linguistic essay on deafness in my family that had no bits of real events, if we want to call them. And so he asked me what you're working on, and I said, oh, it's a kind of a family lexicon only from an intimate sociological perspective. There's no literature. It's a story of how my parents met, migration to, and he said, oh, so you're writing a memoir. And I got prickled and offended as if, and I wondered, why did it hurt me so much in a way? What was wrong in thinking? And then I realized, and that was really a sort of discovery for me, that what defines truth and fiction or literary nonfiction to me had nothing to do with the real occurrence of the event, but with the tone or with the sentiment you're approaching the page. So I was really investigating the possibility of using a sort of desaturated eye, a sort of first person that would visit this family almost as like an anthropologist visiting a foreign community. And maybe remember, did I belong to this community? Did I had a form of exile? When I'm walking in, what's the process of intimacy? What's the process of not remembering? And these kind of erasures of personal and family lexicons, how did that affect the form of the book? So I was very lucky because my parents do not believe in literature in a way, in fiction. They are hardcore supporters of nonfiction in a way. And so I was educated in a sort of environment or ecosystem where the boundaries of these two areas of literature were very confused. And that was, I think, good and liberating the process of writing this book.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think those boundaries probably are confused a lot more than people like to admit or talk about, I think. I also kind of loved the thinking about the more autobiographical elements. I love this part that you wrote about autobiography as a bastard genre of literature, at least according to the old cliche of the literary elite. To those readers, it lowers the threshold, is fodder for anyone. Refugees, women, people with disabilities, Holocaust survivors, survivors of all kinds. And then you go on to talk about the idea of making ourselves important through autobiography. And I thought that was such a brilliant sentiment, like the idea that to write from an I that is close to a personal I has a kind of self-importance about it, and how that can be quite radical, actually, if you're writing a story that is not often considered to be literature or worthy of literature. And I wondered if you could talk about that idea a little bit more.
Yeah, that had to do with expectations we have on the margins. One of my mother's favorite words when I was coming out was emarginato, which means out of the margins in Italian. And it was so interesting when this word became central in my later studies. And I've been thinking about it a lot lately, from Bellux to Elena Ferrante. There's a lot of focus on what margin means. And it was very clear to me in the books that I read growing up that you had expectations of what deafness or disability should be in novels or in nonfiction, what poverty and class should be, or what migration should be. And so this kind of an escapable subject of the good poor, the good migrant, and the good deaf person. The other way where in which disability maybe had been portrayed was the grotesque or the exceptional, a sort of excessive body and monstrosity, overly sexualized. And so I wanted to kind of use my mother, this is a very strong way to put it, as a sort of prism to focus on how all these kinds of marginalities get represented. The reason why I insisted on calling this a novel is because the characters, people I grew up with, were not maybe very bookish people, but had a strive. I call them romantic imposters, because they were kind of desperately accessing for an epic of themselves, like they were self-mythologizing people. And so with that, I thought, if I go to a publisher and say these two teenager deaf kids met in Rome in the 70s, where you had a lot of political unrestlessness, and you had a time of social life in Italy that has been heavily portrayed, but never through the perspective of these kind of people on the margins, they would say, oh, but if they refuse deafness this way, if you have a grandfather that buys a pair of headphones to his deaf daughter, this is excessive, it's not believable. And so they would have maybe edited what I proposed as a novel that I drew from my real life, making it sound implausible. And this is why also it was a little bit playful in a way to work around the expectations we have on the margins and how we kind of put them in the field of nonfiction or fiction. And sometimes it feels to me that novels have, even if they should be very liberating in terms of imagination, are increasingly getting standards on what the representation of certain subjects should be, even if it's in first person.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I also think as a child listening to stories of your family, that there is kind of like a romance or a fiction to them, a sort of larger than life or unrealistic, maybe kind of like texture of those stories when they're things that you've listened to your whole life.
Yes, there's a lot of focus on the character of the mother. And I remember people asking me, oh, the father is less present, but the father is present a lot in visual terms. There's sections where I speak about my father's relationship with fiction and the cinema. He was very attracted by these larger than life characters in American film from the 70s, Scorsese, like all this kind of alienated characters that you would find contemporary and probably in a Paul Thomas Anderson movie. Anyway, I remember going to the movies with my father, seeing an appropriate film for my age, and something turned in him. And so as soon as he walked out of the threshold of the cinema, he would start acting like those characters and confusing the boundaries. So this could have been pedagogically very difficult for a little girl, but in a way, it really educated me, I think, to the liberating potential of fiction, even to that, extreme of embodying fantasies you have, or fantasies that were produced by someone else. And it also kind of disclosed this idea that fiction hurts, and it can hurt more than family ties in a way. So in the book, I also discuss in a veiled way what literature is, and there are painful moments. And I remember friends saying that the most traumatic thing that happened to him was witnessing violence in my family in the little town. And I had no memory of what happened to me, but I was very impressed by the fact that someone else would retain trauma in someone else's life and making it so personal. And I realized that me and my parents and even my grandparents, maybe we didn't perceive what happened to us that way, but we would intensely live emotion and pain, or whatever you want to call it, through fiction. I think The Piano by Jane Campion affected me way more than my mother did in many ways.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I really wanted to speak to you about language, partly because you're a translator, but also because kind of the search for language is so present within this book. We have that, the narrator is a child of Italian migrants. Both of her parents are deaf and didn't teach her to sign. And you write a lot about your parents' kind of mistrust of sort of illusion and metaphor, perhaps because it's a different way to the way they might understand the world. But then I also think it's kind of fascinating that they have become your tools in your adult life. And I just wondered if you think there's a connection between kind of your childhood living in a space between all of these different languages, or searching for a language, and your work as a writer and a translator today.
Yeah, I remember years ago, I was hanging out with a poet, and she asked me, why do you translate? And it's a very simple question, but it was trickier for me compared to why do you write? And I realized that I have been doing that, since I was born, basically, because I was not only in this environment with deaf people, migrants that moved from Italy to the United States, but I was also living in this kind of family that used a black market of language. My grandmother never fully knew Italian. She spoke dialect. She arrived in the United States. She barely spoke it or used some sort of slang. And so there was this transitional language that would change and be very fluid every day. And I think that was a strong influence that unfortunately I have removed for a long time, because when you enroll in public school, when you're a migrant child, you have this very intense, almost soldier-like pose of being performative and learning language in a very orthodoxical way. So I really believed that, full access of being a good citizen and turning into a good person. And so making a distance between me and my parents, who were very disordered speakers for many ways, that had not only to do with their disability, but with their attitude towards life. Unfortunately, I couldn't pick up all the nuances that were hidden in my language. So I would start publishing and writing in Italian. And the most common idea was that it sounded a little off because I had a lot of English in my mind. And then I realized it sounded a little off because I had this very peculiar syntax, this sort of invisible language or broken language I shared with my mother. And we often move from the premise, of course, that language is a mother, but also a mother is a language. And I think I was trying to write this book to translate that specific lexicon I shared with her that suffered of a kind of mutilation because she didn't use sign language, and that forced us to find, different rivers and paths to understand each other. And it's not true that kind of language stamps you or marks you forever. I remember one point feeling very tired about talking with my mother and feeling a sort of guilt, because how do you forget to speak with your own mother? How can you feel, physical boredom or feel very tired? And I think that happens, one, to everyone, but two, it was interesting because my mother said, you're not used to it anymore. And we were in an airport, and she said, if you feel so tired because you've spoken English and you've spoken Chinese for a week and you don't even know Chinese. And I'm like, because I was physically exhausted by gestures that don't mean anything. And it was very moving to see this woman that would turn herself into another continent and sort of, cover the gap that was at that time between us. So this was also a process of archaeology in a way to recover that lost language that shaped my style and my writing.
Yeah, I guess in a way, going back to talking about, most things sitting in the boundary between fiction and truth, and kind of most languages, there's no such thing as like a pure speaker of a particular language. And it is something it's a tool that's organic and fluid. And I love the way that you write about being drawn to the errors in translation, because kind of the way we interpret or translate everything is dependent on our own personal context and understanding. And you call translation a story of poetic imprecision, which I thought was great. And I wondered if you could just explain what you mean by that a little bit more.
Yes, I was focusing on standard, let's say, translations, and it was Peter Pan that kind of gave me this intuition, because Neverland was translated in Italian into L'isola che non c'è, which means the island that's not there, which feels not exactly equivalent to the original meaning. And so I thought that a better translation for that would be a literal translation, like Neverland, my terra, which sounds not good in Italian, but has all of a kind of poetical reverberations and effects that were interesting to explore. And through this mistake, which is a poetic mistake, I realized that my terra is kind of a cry or a shout that a child, as opposed to the world of adults, would use. So in a way, the elegance of the solution of the original translator of that word, Neverland, was not apt in a way, a mistake that could lead you to different possibilities. And it also brought in a different point of view, which was the point of view of the lost children, in a way that don't get involved in the Italian translation of the title because it feels like a judgment. This place does not exist. And so I felt it was interesting because through this poetic error, sometimes someone else cracks in. It's not a binary relationship between the author and the translator. There's also all the kind of ghosts and own mistakes that the author originally translated. And I think it's kind of a detective game in a way. So if you're very good at translation, you're not only good at translating what's on the page, but you're also able to detect the mistakes that were eradicated from the page or from the history of literature, but could have provided a wider meaning and context.
I'm also thinking about the idea of control. So kind of, I suppose the ways in which, in relation to translation and mistakes, I guess you could call a perfect translation one that's very controlled and perhaps not always a positive way. But I'm also thinking about writing, and I think about this a lot in my own work as well. Like, is writing about your life or based on your life a way of gaining control over things that have happened to you? I don't know what the answer is.
Yeah, I think, I don't know about you, but it felt like that for a very long time. And I think to me, control was achievable only relying on a high level or tax of fiction. So my early work, I had my family in disguise, and it was also a different time, a different perspective of writing where third person was also almost mandatory, and it felt very standard and classic. So if you were trying to ease in the world of imagination, it felt that I was supposed to wear certain clothes. And so I had the orthodoxy of Italian. I was not allowing myself to have any slips. Also, even if I had this troubled syntax, but also I was really trying to edit certain events by switching them. So in Strangers I Know, there's an episode where I tell about this man, this father that kidnaps the daughter, which happens to be me. But I already had told this episode in my second novel. But in my second novel, that episode was called fiction, a pure novel. So the characters had different names. The tone and the feeling of those pages, if I read it back, feel very visceral, very angry, very from the perspective of the little girl. I thought I was very grateful for switching and this time trying to focus on the adult man or how he was feeling. I was trying to do this very impossible quest of imagining the life of parents or family without us or before us in a way, and not trying to focus only on my reception or the little girl reception of events. So I think it was a very, very long process to gain control, but I felt that my writing was more visceral when I was doing it. And now that I have loosened up and a lot of barriers fell, not only had I had more fun, I think, but it was in this case that I reached higher fictionality, if that makes any sense. I feel that my what was exposed as a fictional tale of my life was way closer on the border of memoir, whereas this book that it feels conventionally nonfiction has a higher degree of, it feels like a full circle. And so I think I gained control by losing it.
Yeah, I think as well, perhaps sometimes it can be difficult to, like, there are different kinds of truth. So for example, something, you could write a scene that is highly fictional, like lots of the events are made up, but if it contains an emotional truth that's very true to what you felt, then in some ways that can feel more true than something that's a blow by blow account of exactly what happened.
Yes, and I think I was lucky. This book started out of hints, my parents telling me two different accounts of how they met. My mother being proud of being called a stranger and not a deaf woman, which really unnerved me because I thought that, to have a straight path in life, you should accept what was given to you and then decide what to do with that. And so I was very perplexed by this kind of being so ambiguous with something that pertained to your body or the loss of a physical sense. And the other thing that was a clue was Emily Dickinson's quote that opens the book, after a great pain, a formal feeling comes. And to me, the word formal was important, not only because it's what form do you give to a life, but it was also on the kind of distance and temperature. So to me, if that makes any sense, truth has not to do with a solidified sequence of events of how you recall them, but with the tone that you are willing to take account of these events and go back to them. And to me, finding this kind of decentered perspective, it's what distinguishes this book compared to the convention of something that happened to yourself that has to be very warm in a way or necessarily hot. I don't recount that in my journals. The most traumatic or intense or happiest experiences that happened to me were quieter sometimes compared to the huge spaces of boredom that I had in my youth that were instead overwritten in a way to counter the force of boredom.
I think as well, so much of this book is about striving for a connection and a sense of belonging, kind of through the experience of migration. So from kind of New York to southern Italy to London amongst the landscape of Brexit. And also as the child of deaf parents, kind of searching for a shared experience. And my own younger brother is deaf. And I think about this quite a lot. The feeling that in lots of ways, our childhoods were very similar, and yet they were also completely different because we had vastly different experiences in the way that we experienced the world and interacted with our parents. And I thought you summarized this feeling really beautifully when you wrote about your partner or the partner in the book playing the piano and your mother resting her hands on the top to feel the vibrations. And you write, "She says she can hear it and I believe her. We may be listening to two different things, but I wonder if they converge somewhere. If at some point what's visible of a sound might dissolve and blend into what's invisible. And I wondered, like, it's very poignant talking about that specific relationship, but could we apply this to everything, really? The act of translation, reading, writing, trying to communicate with another person. What do you think?
Yeah, I do believe that this kind of approach to share the commonalities, even in the most paradoxical situation, because over here you have, a daughter that lives in a certain realm that we consider made by sound, noise, and gaps of silence, and that really makes you question in the mother's world what it means: sound, noise, silence, and meaning. And not necessarily I felt that these were completely mutually exclusive experiences. I had outside world that was encouraging me to think that the meanings between me and her would never overlap in a way. So the piano, in that case, vibration is a device in the sense that a word, a sound, a content you read, a scene you see in a film, I think for all of us retain personal meaning and also have a little bit of it that is shared, but maybe it's shared in an unexpected ways. So when I wrote Strangers I Know, I was very troubled, but also curious and I really felt I wanted to be an intersectional book in a way where all parts of identity or the self could clash and dissolve one into the other, and to focus on what shatters, what stays, the sources of personal history. And I was worried that with this abundancy of marginalities, let's say exceptionalities, there wouldn't be a connection or understanding. And weirdly enough, this book created in many ways tiny portals where I met people that had very life circumstances and had a completely different experience of family lexicon and silence, and then they connected profoundly. And so I wondered, I think it was almost provocative as a perspective to show that in even marginal or exceptional circumstances of life, and this is why we do read fiction, we do find a bit of ourselves. And so I think that was really automatic for me growing up, always building these sort of bridges and also sometimes burning them behind them, because I think I always wanted to say that it is possible to forget, reassemble, and also give up on this kind of search for a common space. It's something that comes and goes in a way, and I think the mother-daughter relationship shows this in the book. So there are moments where they do find common meanings and there are moments where this dissolves. So I think I wanted it to sound very fluid as an experience and not have it's like a vocabulary that gets reinvented all the time rather than having a certain standard grammar of relationships.
Do you think as well that if you are a child who grows up in any kind of multilingual household, do you think it sort of alters your relationship to language a little bit? Like, I sometimes think about having grown up in a house with English and sign language, the sort of like materiality or the symbolic nature of language felt more true to me in perhaps a way, more true than perhaps it would if you'd only ever grown up with an awareness of one language. Do you think that alters the way, like as a child, you form your understanding of what language is?
Definitely. A lot of people make fun of me sometimes because I have what is considered to be a defect in understanding, which is funny for a writer, the symbolic, allegoric, or metaphorical ways of life. This is very strong for me and reading literature, but when you live and you have daily experiences, I often have the issue of taking things literally, like my parents, that happened with them. So the total inability, it's like almost surrendering to the literal meaning of something. And that affected, I think, my way of perceiving things, and perhaps sometimes made me more It definitely made me more visual, but in many ways, but it also made me more an essentialist, I would think, in certain things, and trying to find the true core of that experience and stick to that. And so it was in a way switching from the world of text, where I was able, to learn about all the kind of hidden under meanings or higher meanings or everything that floats around an image, and instead in daily life having this kind of instinct of thinking, taking things literally. So I think that was and I'm curious about how these two forces influence each other and how I approach writing.
I also wanted to talk to you about your representation of disability. You touched on it a little bit earlier, but it felt really radical to me to read about someone as the father in the book who was not interested in facing disability with bravery or dignity, but with recklessness and oblivion. And at the end of the book, the mother says that if she hadn't been deaf, she would have been insignificant. And I found that very moving, and it made me think of how rarely we see deafness, or indeed like a lot of disabilities, portrayed like this as a kind of a driving force behind these characters' lives, or something that is so integral to who they are and a source of strength. And it made me wonder if kind of like one of the messages of your book is that kind of like to have true agency, or to have true power, or to have true equality, it's about the choice to kind of like face your life in whichever way you want, not about having to be dignified or humble or sad. Is that something that you were thinking about?
Yes, going back to the title of the book. So you had this woman who was deaf. She moved from New York to a town in southern Italy, and I would, go with her, visit little villages, and people would say, "Oh, she speaks funny. She speaks loud. Her sounds are not right. Her words are not right. I was, where does she come from?" Almost if she came, an alien from outer space. So the immediate thought was not about a disability, but it was about a difference. And it was interesting to me why my mother was, and she said, "Oh, I fooled them. They think I'm a stranger." And I thought that it was kind of sad, the fact that the frame around her would make her feel that being deaf was something shameful, or using sign language would make you very visible, theatrical, immediately exposed in the streets. But then when I was writing this book, I found out that in a way she was disclosing the sense of self-affirmation. So any word, especially the word stranger, it could be beautiful if you reclaim it for yourself, but it could be hurtful if someone else is using it as a tool, to remove you from a space or a society or a country. And so to me, it was very clear about, shape shifting words, even deafness in that case. Sometimes it was very visible in the household, and I was relating to a deaf woman. Sometimes it disappeared completely, and I was dealing with an artist, with a person that had certain interests, and it was also instrumental. I remember that sometimes my mother, who was violently opposed to the idea of being considered disabled, she just wanted it to be considered different. She would say, "Oh, I can do this. I'm like you." And we said, "Then do it." And then sometimes we would say, "Do this." And she said, "Oh no, I'm deaf. I can't." So to me, this kind of playfulness and ambiguity around something that would, constantly be renegotiated was very fascinating. And I think that does not relate only to disability. It was, again, using a concept or an object to see how we do play this game with all areas. In a way, to me, when I had to focus on something that was relevant to myself, it came to maybe the approach that my mother had to deafness. I had it when I went to college with class. I never used a kind of parameter. I found out that I belonged to the underclass when I met the radical left in college, in a way, because I was in a little town, and it was obvious to me that some people had money and they didn't have money, but it was a very informal way. So it's when I met theory that I realized, oh, there is a definition. Should I claim it for myself? What happens if I do? What happens if I don't? What happens if I'm in a liminal space and I don't feel at ease? And this is a process of conquering back something. And so my mother, who never called herself openly deaf, we were walking in London years ago, and I said, how your life would have been? And she said it would have been insignificant. And I thought it was very moving because it had nothing to do with happiness in a way, but it had to do with meaning. And so that was one of the few times where I felt that she was really owning it, as you said. So she was using agency for something that has been a question. I think deafness, some parts of identity are questions you ask yourself constantly.
Yeah, I know through my brother that that can be quite a strong sentiment, like within the deaf community. Not that deaf people have a disability, but that it's the way that the world is structured. That's the problem, because the world is structured like for hearing people. And you said something similar where you said, like you were talking about the subtitles on the TV, and you said that it's hearing people often who deem like what's worth being translated. It's like the people who are doing the translating hold a lot of power. And I wondered if you think about that in your own work as a translator as well, kind of the maybe the joy of it and the freedom of it, but kind of the responsibility of it maybe as well.
Yes, it's interesting because lately I've done something that never happened to me, which was translating for a TV series written in English for the Italian audience, and it has to involve subtitles. I was trying to explain to the author that his dialogues would be exposed to the reduction of subtitles, and I felt the pain of the loss. And he was asking, who's going to make this choice? Who selects one word compared to the other? We have to do this dramatic shrinking of information. And that got me back to this kind of paradox where you are selecting information in texts meant for a deaf community of non-hearing people, but then you're having hierarchies over there that are set, and often the hierarchies are based on the idea that the simplest thing, but then you're giving up. If you're opting for, a content and simple, you're maybe giving up on what can be a poetical aspect, and you're assuming that who's reading that is not interested. So I think good translation and good writing always have to keep the two moments together. Of course, the preoccupation we have with form and content in our own work, it really gets political and radical when you are treating texts for a widened community and that have to make sense in different contexts. So I just wish there was more awareness and not given for granted the idea that what you want to do, but this is also relevant for media information that is not addressed, only to deaf people, or is addressed also to people that have low levels of literacy. Why is that you think that if you summarize, shrink, and reduce the essence of information, you're doing what is meant to do it is good work. It's a good operation of translating a language and giving up all the other notations and ethics. That's giving up a lot on the possibilities of what language do. And I think there's a shared hunger for beauty, and we assume that beauty is a preoccupation that only certain parts of society or readership has.
I also wanted to talk to you about class. You touched on it a little bit earlier, but I really appreciated kind of how nuanced your portrayal of class is. So you described the way that kind of to be working class in Basilicata is completely different to being working class in Brooklyn, or kind of your own class identity, where you might take long haul flights or have brand new trainers, but kind of be unable to afford food and be in a lot of debt. And I really like the way you sort of deconstruct the like rags to riches narrative that we're very familiar with, and talk about, I guess in a similar vein of kind of like having agency, as we were talking about earlier, like to really have any kind of equality. It's about like maybe just staying where you are, or maybe not striving for success, or maybe having opportunities and not following them up, and how to explore those aspects of class. It seems like we're only really ever given one narrative when we're talking about working class culture, and it's like someone who's worked hard and bettered themselves and joined the middle class. And yeah, I wondered why that felt important to you to deconstruct that a bit.
I think I followed the mainstream narrative that as a working class girl who wouldn't recognize herself as so, that there's a moment in your life where you're poor, you grow up, you read theory, you find out about Marx, and then you call yourself working class. But before I developed a consciousness of it, there was this issue of poverty, and poverty came in my family with a sort of disguise that was not out of shame in a way. There was no humility in my mother's approach to it. There was this kind of fantasy or fictionalizing yourself and having wider possibilities through debt, which became very common after, the past two financial crises, also for our generations in a way. I felt that we all of a sudden discovered that our material conditions wouldn't match certain ambitions. But if we were constantly recurring to debt, why that debt was different from, certain poor families that were using it as a device, as they always did. And I've seen that for a long time. And so when I started to think about class, I realized I had a sort of melancholy, and it's not only the melancholy of, entering a different realm compared to my mother. When I suddenly had jobs, I could help her, and we have this reverse approach of who's taking care of who. And so I tell that in the book, that sometimes in order to give my mother empowerment and agency, I pretend, and she knows I'm pretending, that I need support, and then I give her back. And so we have this sort of microeconomy that is a protective form, but is not sufficient for her, and it's not sufficient for me, because the melancholy I was talking about is about all the time that I didn't waste, and I could have wasted in discovering other parts of myself. When I say that I was following the narrative, I was very militant in bettering myself and studying. And so to me, there was only one course of life. You have to study, you have to improve your situation, pretty much as in a neo-Victorian novel, and then you will belong to this society of adults. And so I was thinking, because I'm always obsessed about the holograms of ourselves, what happened to that person that maybe in squandering time? Squandering time is not only a privilege, it could be also a right in a way. So in the book, I was arguing that not only the sons of the bourgeoisie, the bohos, are, have the right to squander time and find out about their artistic selves. And so maybe not even artistic, maybe I would have been interested in other jobs. This is relevant for everyone, I guess, to second guess your life and what you could have done. But for working class children, it feels that it's strength in a way. And so I was always also trying, as you said, to kind of counter the idea that the desire is always to grow, improve, make more. I think that's a distorted message. And what kind of energies can you liberate if, you not necessarily you wanted more and you wanted something different?
Yeah, I think that's really key. And I think maybe there's an idea that if you're working class, you have smaller wants. You're not allowed you're not allowed for your desires to be just as big as someone who is middle class or very affluent often. I think that's not recognized, or that's not a narrative that we recognize.
Also, yes. And then, but one thing, positive side of it is that sorry if I use it as larger we, but we're both preoccupied with class, is the fact that we could have, the only guilt is that if you don't do more. But once you give up the idea of doing more in a certain way, and then you realize that desire can express itself in different areas of life, you do it without a sense of guilt that is very relevant to the personality and ideals of who's raised and born and writes in a middle class way. I don't know, at one point I just got so fed up with novels that had this kind of guilt or sense of guilt with money. And as a paradox, it rarely comes in working class fiction, I must say.
Yeah, I think that's true. Well, thanks so much for being so generous with your thoughts. It's been brilliant to talk to you, and thanks so much to everyone for watching. And Claudia's novel Strange as I Know is out now from Fitzcarraldo, and you can order a copy by clicking the link below. Thanks, Claudia.
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. Bye, everyone.